What's going on, guys? So we're gonna do a reaction video. I know I'm posting two videos in one day. This one's gonna be a lot more chill though, because we're not talking about that anymore. But yeah, I'm sure this is probably also gonna grind my gears a bit because I'm an Nvidia user, and I'm sure that there's gonna be plenty of shitting on Nvidia going on in this video. But I wanted to give my take on it, and I have not watched it, so this is a Linus Tech Tips video about which GPU is best for Linux gaming. I will say, just to start off with, that it's interesting to see how much big YouTubers are talking about Linux these days. Like, we've seen it with Jay's 2 Cents, and Gamers Nexus is starting to do Linux benchmarks, and they've been talking about Linux a lot more, and so is Linus. So, it's ultimately good for the community, but it's always good to take these videos with a grain of salt. These guys aren't Linux users, and it's always good to give them Linux user feedback from people who actually daily drive Linux. So without further ado, let's get into it.
You know what? I'm done. Between forced updates, bloatware, and AI features that nobody asked for,
What in heaven's name are you doing, son?
I'm not even going to talk about Linus being in a trash can.
He's not dead. He just needs the right medicine.
But I have an NVIDIA GPU. Isn't that a sin, according to Reddit?
Maybe? It is true that the mere mention of NVIDIA in a Linux forum can start an argument. But when Linus Torvalds, the man himself, was here, he mentioned that Linux and NVIDIA have somewhat mended the relationship now that NVIDIA is balls deep in the AI bubble and needs Linux developers on their side. Which raises the question, is AMD still the best GPU choice for Linux? And where does Intel land? To find out, we spent weeks testing, and I don't just mean FPS numbers. I'm talking setup process and day-to-day usability too. Now, as you might expect, AMD does remain a very strong choice, but you might be shocked. Shocked, I say, when you see how far the others, especially certain ones, have come.
Okay. Maybe it won't be a total shit show for Nvidia in this video.
Before we get into the results, let's talk about the setup process. We chose these 5 GPUs.
I just want to read this. Intel Arc, Battle Mage, RTX 56. Oh god, he would have to pick well, see, he's picking like the 5060 Ti, 4060 Ti. Those are pretty weak cards. And the NVIDIA DX12 issue, the weaker your card is, the more that's going to be, the harder hit that's going to be. At least they're not super old. So that's another thing too, like the older architecture, like if you're using like a 1660 or God forbid a 10 series card or something, then you're really going to see those cards. Basically, the older the architecture, the worse the DX12 problem is, and especially with the 1080 support being dropped, the upcoming DX12 fix that is in the works won't be coming to that ever. So those cards are just permanently fucked. But I digress.
Used to represent both recent and slightly older gaming cards from the main brands. And also, Intel was there. As for our distro, our original plan, when this was an article on lttlabs.com, was good old Ubuntu 2404 LTS,
oh God,
or
no,
long-term
not
support.
Ubuntu.
Why that one? Well, while there are numerous more gaming-focused distros, like Bazzite or SteamOS, we decided to approach this experiment with the idea that we wanted a stable, user-friendly, well-supported desktop experience that can also game. We ran into a problem that will likely be familiar to any Linux early adopter: driver support. Out of our 5 GPUs, 4 of them failed to work out of the box. Some were easy fixes. For the 4060 Ti, Ubuntu has a driver on their additional drivers page, and after a short reboot, it worked flawlessly. But the 5060 Ti, that was a bit of a different story.
Your first mistake was using Ubuntu.
See, back when we originally did this testing, Ubuntu didn't have a driver for it at all, meaning we had to settle for the official driver from NVIDIA, which, if you ask any Linux head, they're going to tell you is a big no-no. As for our Radeon 9070, it too was lacking baked-in drivers, and AMD hadn't yet rolled out their official installer. Finally, the Arc B580 appeared to be working until the moment we fired up a game and it showed its true colors. Turns out that the
You know, the ironic part about this is if he had used an actual gaming distro, he wouldn't have had any of these problems.
easiest fix was to use Kubuntu, which uses the KDE desktop environment rather than GNOME. Of course, all of these issues have since been resolved. Yay, open source! So, what's the point of bringing them up? Well, we said we'd talk about the experience, and it turns out that for us, the bottom line is that it comes down less to which brand of GPU you choose, and more down to the age and the exact timing. The easiest fix across the board for all of them was simply to move off of LTS and use Ubuntu 25, which just uses a newer version of the Linux kernel that had baked-in support for all of our cards. With everything up and running, how's the day-to-day life? Well, this is where things get totally fine, actually. Most people these days, except for you, Dave, and by the way, you're so good at using computers, do a huge percent of their work in a browser. Google Docs, Teams, support tickets, even some design work can now be done fully within a browser. And even for the work that isn't, some combination of Linux alternative software, virtual machines, or remote desktop applications could probably allow most people to make the switch. Of course, the day-to-day usability of Linux is not the point of this video. The point of this video is the difference in that experience between our various cards. And I kind of hate to say it, but it's kind of a draw again. I know that's not very satisfying, and I'm sure that you would much rather that I praise the corporate brand that you love and bash the one that you really hate. But Linus Torvalds himself is doing his day-to-day work right now on an Intel Arc. Not because of how special it is compared to the other options, but because for his work, it just plain didn't matter that much. He actually cared more about how quiet the cooler was. With that said, there will be some huge exceptions to this. Depending on the software you use, there could be major differences in performance, compatibility, and stability. But which card works best for training LLMs or whatever? That's beyond the scope of this video. Which brings us to the big question. What about the games? Now, before we show you the numbers, it's important to understand that our usual testing software doesn't work quite the same across Windows and Linux. That's why we stuck to simple in-game benchmarking tools. Also, for that reason, we can't draw a definitive conclusion about exactly how the Linux and Windows performance compares to each other. What we can do is get a broad impression, and we can say that across all of our three brands, if you were hoping for a big win for Linux, unfortunately, that still isn't the case. Across the board, we saw lower performance on Linux at 1080p, both with and without ray tracing, and at 1440p. Of course, that's not the question that's most on our minds right now. Rather, we want to know which...
You're also, again, testing gaming benchmarks on Ubuntu. Like, don't get me wrong. Ubuntu is well loved for a reason. There's also a great number of people who despise Ubuntu, but that's besides the point. You know, you're going to have to take these gaming metrics versus Windows with a grain of salt, because I've seen gaming benchmarks, as particularly with AMD, where performance is better on Linux versus Windows. But you're using Ubuntu, which is a base distro, and I'm sure they didn't install anything. You know, they probably just installed Steam and installed some games and, you know, called it a day. You know, they aren't using like an optimized kernel or even necessarily a very up-to-date Mesa stack. You know what I mean? Like, I'm interested to see what NVIDIA driver version they were using too. I'm sure it's probably not the latest one. But let's continue watching.
which GPU maker loses the least performance switching over to Linux. Starting with Intel, the B580 was about 30% worse on average. That means that most of your games are going to run a full class of card worse, and you might even find outliers, like what we saw with Dota 2, that are frankly unacceptable. I mean, look at this. This game has a native Linux build. That means no Proton compatibility layer, and yet it's getting barely over half of the performance.
Yeah, native Linux games, in my experience, it's almost always better to run games, the Windows version in Proton versus running the native Linux version. I don't know why, but they always seem to have some kind of weird performance issue or something.
Compared to Windows. As for NVIDIA, well, things got a little spicy here to say the least. Do you remember I mentioned that our original article tested on Ubuntu 24? Well, in that test, the older 4060 Ti was still within striking distance of our Windows tests in a fair number of our games. Some were further off, but it was pretty close. As for our 5060 Ti, I mean, it is a faster, better card, but the difference between Windows and Linux was about 30%, just like we saw with Intel. Yikes. Though, not as yikes as the internet might have you believe. What is as yikes is the fact that upgrading to Ubuntu 25 for the retesting that we did for this video saw an overall regression in Linux optimization across both of our NVIDIA cards. Or, I don't know, maybe they tuned the Windows drivers to be even better? All I can say for sure is that NVIDIA could use just a few of their trillions of dollars to do a little bit better here. Bringing us finally to AMD, and, well, it won't be a huge surprise to many of you, but it turns out that if you let open source folks do open source things with your drivers, you might get better open source performance, with some games, like Cyberpunk 2077, seeing almost no performance loss, and even some outliers, like Strange Brigade on our RX 9070, that actually performed better on Linux. For gaming then, AMD emerges once again as a clear winner. So, if we factor that in, let's see here, we've got AMD wins gaming, everything else is a draw. AMD wins! Or do they? Our final test was to throw a couple of different distros into the mix because, let's face it, our entire comments section would be complaining if we didn't. Since AMD came out on top, we wanted to see how our RX 7700 XT would handle Bazzite, Manjaro, Ubuntu 25, and Ubuntu 24 across 3 games. And what we found was that
There was functionally no difference between the three.
which I gotta say is honestly a really good thing. I think the last thing that the Linux community wants is a war over which distro performs the best for gaming. There's already enough of a war over the ease of use of gaming across various distros, or wants is a war over which distro performs the best for gaming. There's already honestly a really good thing.
There was functionally no
I just wanted to look at this. Test at max setting, ray traces off, 1080p, higher is better, herb. Bazzite, Manjaro. So Manjaro, Ubuntu. This is on the RX 7700 XT. They're also testing this at 1080p, which doesn't really tell the whole story. Because if you're testing at 1080p, you're going to be more CPU bound than you are, especially on a middle tier card that can handle, a 7700 XT should be able to handle 1080p gaming, no problem. So you're going to see a lot more balance there across the board in distros anyways, because you're going to see more, it's going to, like, driver mesa version and optimizations and stuff isn't going to matter as much, because you're basically, you're running top of the game no matter what, because you're running at a resolution that your card is punching above. So, at that point you're going to just be limited with more like how efficiently the system can render frames versus more GPU bound situations where you're actually pushing the card hard. And you can see this because we're talking about running like Cyberpunk 2077, getting 120 FPS in Cyberpunk 2077. I mean, that really tells you how efficient the card is. And this is a great example of how Black Myth Wukong is just a really demanding game. It's interesting that in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the older Ubuntu LTS outpaced everyone by 1 frame.
No difference between the three, which I gotta say is honestly a really good thing. I think the last thing that the Linux community wants is a war over which distro performs the best for gaming. There's already enough of a war over the ease of use of gaming across various distros, or the unique value propositions that they offer from pre-installed applications and features, or slick UIs for organizing your favorite retro titles. So, in conclusion then, AMD wins, but it's also totally valid to go Linux on any GPU hardware. In fact, I think it's fair to say that for most people out there, it really doesn't matter that much. Certainly, it doesn't matter enough that you should wait until you can afford a new GPU before you take the Linux plunge. If you're interested in jumping ship from Windows, you're not alone right now. And I think that your bigger roadblocks are going to be around settling on a distro that suits you and getting all of your devices and workflows running. But the good news is that there's an ever-growing number of resources out there for new users, and we're going to link some of those below for you guys to take a look at. One way or another, the year of the Linux desktop is getting ever closer, and arguably, I would say is even today for people that mostly work inside a browser or would rather give up a little bit of performance than put up with Windows's bullshit. Creator of the Linux kernel. He actually ended up going with an Intel Arc for his new computer and even talked.
Okay, so that video didn't go how I expected, honestly. I was expecting much more doom and gloom with NVIDIA because that's just the typical thing, especially with people who don't know much about Linux. They kind of just parrot what they hear a lot of times. Yeah, it was a surprising video. My only real criticism is that they didn't talk about, I guess, some things that are supported versus others. I would have liked to have seen maybe a bit more in depth on different things supported by AMD and NVIDIA, like, like a big thing that nobody ever talks about is that AMD can't support HDMI 2.1 on Linux, whereas NVIDIA can. And then, of course, there's NVIDIA having CUDA cores and making it much better for lots of productivity workflows and rendering, and even when it comes to like AI stuff and like if you want to learn or run local AI models, NVIDIA is way better for. So there are definitely like benefits to NVIDIA versus AMD, just like there are some benefits AMD versus NVIDIA. But I feel like it gets kind of passed over, like especially HDMI, because that was something that bit me in the ass when I switched to Linux, was the lack of because when I first like got set up, I bought a 7900 XT for my PC, and I put a 7900 XT in my PC because I wanted to have the GameScope session experience, and well, I ended up not having a good time with that because I have a 4K TV with HDMI 2.1 and 144 hertz and all that, and when I set to 4K 120, I started like having a flash, my screen would like intermittently flash black, and I was like, what the hell's going on? Well, it turns out my problem was HDMI 2.1 support. So I found out about that the hard way, and I ended up returning the card, and uh, eventually wound up buying a 4080 Super instead, and ended up on Nvidia. So, and Peak OS. So, um, I feel like that's something that needs to be mentioned more because, especially people switching, like if you use HDMI in your setup, um, you know, people aren't going to assume that HDMI is going to be an issue. I mean, I certainly did not see it coming at all. I thought, you know, I thought it would be a universal thing, just like it is on Windows. I didn't know about the HDMI forum being dicks, and people are quick to bring that up too. That the HDMI forum's the ones responsible. But as I always tell people when they say that, this is true, but it really doesn't have any bearing on the end effect on the user. I mean, we can point fingers at whose fault it is, but at the end of the day, HDMI 2.1 on AMD is still uh, not something that can be reliably done. I mean, there are tales of certain HDMI converter cords that may or may not work. It's a difficult thing because DisplayPort uses different protocols and stuff. So trying to convert it to HDMI and have it work reliably, especially in a passive conversion, is sketchy at best. So yeah, um, it was a good video. I'm surprised, and it definitely paints a good picture. I do think the 30% performance loss implications on AMD are kind of strange. I mean, I could see it with Nvidia on DX12 being a thing currently, but uh, to see like worse performance and on AMD is kind of strange because like in my experience, like the only AMD, I mean, I have my ROG Ally X, which obviously has an AMD chipset in it, and I definitely see better performance there versus the same games running in Windows. I mean, not like crazy better, but noticeably smoother. Like Dragon Ball Sparking Zero, for instance, runs much better on Linux on my handheld than it did on Windows. Just an example. But end of the day, there are some performance trade-offs. You are ultimately running games in Proton, um, and no matter which GPU you go with, you're going to see varying performance. Sometimes some games are going to perform better. Some games are going to perform worse. With NVIDIA, DX12 games pretty much always perform worse because uh, the Vulkan has a weird issue with the NVIDIA driver that's being worked on, but they're having to write a new Vulkan extension for it, and that's what's been taking so long. It's not even a driver level problem. It's actually, um, to my understanding, it has to do with how Vulkan interacts with the NVIDIA driver being inefficient, essentially, and it causes the VKD 3D translator to basically run worse, um, which is what causes the DX12 performance loss. It's not a huge deal to me usually because my card is powerful enough that um, I can kind of just eat the handicap and still play my games. But I can definitely see it being a bigger issue for people with older / weaker cards. Like I imagine, it's probably pretty bad on a 4060 for some games, more demanding games, or a significantly older card. So, um, but to hear him say that the year of the Linux desktop might be here is pretty crazy, especially coming from the guy who uninstalled his desktop installing Steam. So, you know, uh, it's always a good thing to hear when normal people are really starting to come around to Linux. So yeah, that's it for me today, guys. I will catch you next time. I'm trying OBS to see. I've got this weird rendering issue in Plasma, man. I don't know what's causing it. So it's definitely Plasma related. I just don't know if it's the driver or if it's some weird render. I want to say it's got to be something weird going on in Plasma 6.5 because that's when it started, is when 6.5 came out. And of course now PicoOS has finally moved up to Plasma 6.5.4. So from 6.3.6 they skipped 6.4 altogether. But so yeah, we're still dealing with that. I'm gonna see if OBS is having the same problem in this video. And if not, then I'm probably gonna like go for a hybrid recording approach where I use like GPU screen recorder for recording games and use OBS for when I'm doing stuff on the desktop. But at least until this problem gets fixed. But yeah, that's it for me today, guys. Y'all have a good one.